Oh, 1977. I was about around 4 years old. Might be getting close to five. I don't know then. But strangely enough, back then, maybe this comic I'm about to show you is making me remember things. I talked to my girl yesterday, and we talked about a few things about it. But it really does seem like I don't think it's where I was just a kid, but the skies were bluer, the air was sweeter, and everything just seemed to be just more pure than today, a lot more simpler, right? Of course it was, right? But I've always talked about how when I was a kid, there was comic books in my house from the uncle and stepdad and all this stuff going on, all these magazines and everything. Having comic books in the house was like having a television set, no different than having a record player, no different than having a radio or a laptop now, or even a cell phone. Not a big deal. They were just sort of there. But there's a certain kind of magic when you're just kind of wandering around the house when you're a kid. I was like tiny, had blonde hair, you know, cut like a Dutch boy is what it was and stuff. And I found these coverless comics because you got to remember that, a lot of reasons that older comics were worth money, and we look for grades and the shapes that they're in, how have they survived. Those older books, they didn't have backing boards and bags and boxes to put them in and stuff, right? I've seen comic books in milk crates and stuff, and paper bags from the grocery stores. Seriously, things like that. I've seen them in old chests, that you'd have at the bottom of your bed and stuff, right? Just piled up inside of them and everything. So one morning, I just kind of remember that I found a stack of coverless comic books. And these comic books were like 80-page giants, 100-page giants, Korak, Son of Tarzan, space adventures, strange adventures, sci-fi comics and things, and they didn't have the covers on them. And they had these great advertisements in them. They were huge. So tracking down some of those books over the years has been a little bit of a challenge because they didn't have a cover on them. They didn't have that first page where we have all the legalities at the bottom where it tells you the book, the volume, the number, and things like that. So when I ran across this, I ordered this off eBay a week ago, last Friday. And this thing came in this past Friday, so it took 7 days to come in from eBay. And it's one of the few books I actually went ahead and I still haggled the guy. I got it $5 cheaper than he wanted on eBay, but I still paid a little bit for it, and it was totally worth it because this is one of those books that's the pages are still in my mind. Maybe it's my first Batman comic I ever read. Maybe it's not, but this was one of the books that just engulfed me. You know what I mean? Like, I read that stack of coverless comic books and stuff for days and studied them and was mesmerized. And after getting this and flipping through it and reading some of the stories that I remembered and stuff, I can tell that my 4-year-old little mind and probably that memory over the past 41 years really expanded some of the comics. And I think that's probably part of the magic of reading comics is you filling in the gaps. You actually, maybe it's where I was young. I don't know. You know what I mean? But, that part of your imagination that expands, that kind of works with the story and stuff, right? But I'm talking about Giant Batman number 213. This was one of those comics that, the stories in it were just amazing to me, to my 4-year-old little mind. And by today's standards, these are pretty simple stories and things, but they've really influenced them. This was a 30th anniversary edition of Batman. He'd been around 30 years. This came out around 1969, and it reprinted 5 great stories. And over the years, I kind of sort of kept an eye out for it, but what threw me off is on the inside, it says Giant Batman on the top of the pages, which made me think it was a 100-page special, maybe even an annual, anything but what it was, just an issue of Batman, which was their 30th anniversary. As you can see, it has the origin of Robin, it has the origin of Alfred, and it has the Game of Death. But the stories that got me was, when I was a kid, and they still kind of get me, is the Man Behind the Red Hood and the origin of Clayface. Of course, the Red Hood story, if you go back to the Alan Moore classic, The Killing Joke, there's no way that story didn't influence it. Grant Morrison has pulled from some of these stories. If you go back to his run on Batman during the 2000s, he was on the book a long time. And, of course, the origin of Clayface. So it was really interesting to read this book when I was 4. The book was probably about half of the book after going through this. The only stories that were really complete in it was The Man Behind the Red Hood and The Origin of Clayface. So when I got the book, I was really impatient. I got the alert that it was in. It took the guy a few days to actually put it in the mail to get it to me. When I realized I was not going to be able to get off work in order to get back to the post office in time, I called him up and had him put it in a locker. But some of the images held true to what I remembered. As soon as I got to this page, the Red Hood story in here, I just fell down. Now, this was originally in Detective Comics, I think. Another thing that threw me off, about where this thing was reprinted. And first of all, I can't complain about the shape of this book. This book is a year shy of 50 years old, and there are actually some crisp, creamy pages in here, which just blows my mind. And this is what I was talking about on the top of it, Giant Batman. So that's what was throwing me off all those years with that memory. So I get in here and I start reading this, and I actually remembered some of these panels from when I was a kid, which was just amazing. I don't know who drew this or anything like that, but, just the whole bizarre concept of having a hood that had no eye holes in it when you're a kid is just, that's just enough to kind of blow your mind. Kids are pretty simple to impress or get their attention. Plus, they're really honest. If a little kid tells you you've got a bad haircut, you have a bad haircut. So if a little kid tells you something's cool in a comic book, you might want to look again because they have no filter. They're just completely honest. So as I was looking through this, the whole concept of the stories that I remember, how this thing just flowed along, how I was able to read it day after day, the whole and seeing the Joker for the first time that I could recall in a comic book, all that is quite magnificent, and there's a magic to it. This really sort of took me back. I'm always talking about, well, at least a few years ago, I said I like watching new people get into comic books and start their YouTube channels, because there's this want that I'll never do, but I would love to be able to go back and read Watchmen for the first time. I would love to go out and be able to read Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns for the first time. And this is as close as I'm going to be able to get to reading something again for the first time that I loved. So going back and reading this as an adult, I think this would still hooked me, but the stories were much more dynamic. It was like as a kid, I was able to really immerse myself into this world and fill in the gaps with what I was talking about. We have one panel of being outside in the dark, and there's woods and a house and everything like that. And as a kid, I was there. I could almost hear the crickets where I read and reread this. I remember this. And I read it now, and I'm just sort of like, wow, it's a simple little panel, but I was so there. But when it came to the Clayface story, I remember this story taking place in a cave. This Clayface found like this, I don't know if it was a natural pool full of colors. So I don't know if it was radiation or magic or what it was supposed to have been. But the scoop, he finds the pool of colors in this cave, and it turns him into Clayface. Now, as a kid, I thought that was just horrible. This was just like a tragic hero. I didn't have the words, but I was sort of like, he's misunderstood, leave him alone. Something's really bad happened to him. But when he's in the cave, he goes underwater to get into the cave. He comes up, takes off his scuba gear, and we just have, we barely have any panels showing the cave. But when I read this as a kid, I was in that cave. I could smell that musty smell. I could hear the dripping of it. At this time, I'm 4 years old. I don't think I'd ever been in a cave. Probably saw some movie or something where there was a cave, but I could hear water dripping off stalactites. I could smell that musty smell. I could see the dark that's in there, and where's this weird glow coming from. It's just amazing how, as a kid, your imagination really adds to the story. So when I read this, I was like, this is the same story, but I remember it taking place in a cave more. And of course, it's Batman, so, there's a bat cave. It's probably supposed to be in there. But it was really cool to go back and find the book and reread it as an adult. So as I was talking about this yesterday, about why the stories seemed a little bit different, how I remembered it different, it's just really amazing how over the years we can add to a story, or a story can hit you so hard and immerse itself in you and stay in your mind that you start realizing which stories you really loved when you were a kid. And I've shown Thor annuals that I read as a kid with the Guardians of the Galaxy in them. I've shown the What If book of Conan the Barbarian. What if he roamed the earth today? And I can talk about all that stuff. I showed my first Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes comic that I ever bought with my money when I was 6 and stuff. But as dynamic as those were, and as well known as some of those books can be, the more popular books, it's kind of funny how a couple of little simple run of the mill Batman stories uh, that kind of focus on the villains really grabbed me as a kid and made me want to read comics more. Just a real simple video. I have a haul video I can make and stuff. I picked up a few things over the last couple weeks, but getting this really kind of reminded me about why I collect, what got me into collecting, about the stories and the characters and stuff. It'd be really cool to be able to go back to that again and kind of start all over for me. That would be really cool. Maybe I can do that with European comics. I've been dabbling into some Tardy and watching a few channels like Mind the Comics, Earl Grey's Panelology. I hope I'm getting that right. I know when I binge watch, I watch quite a bit of videos and stuff, right? So it's kind of a cool idea to kind of explore out of the realms of American comics with DC and Marvel. How Marvel is now irrelevant in my opinion, and DC is really getting to be hit or miss with their stunts and stuff. Inconsistent with their quality. It seems like it's either really good or it's just throwaway stuff. And again, one of the things I hear with the current climate of, if you look up comics online, videos, Twitter, anything like that, how nasty some of it can be. One of the most asinine things I can ever hear is somebody saying comics have always been political. And when I hear people say that, you might as well just dismiss them because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the difference between a story being political, the idea that there are comics that had zero politics in them that outweigh more than comic books that kind of dabbled into politics. And they also know the difference between indoctrination and propaganda, just like some people, and I put it on par with the fact that you don't know the difference between a religion and joining a cult, So it's kind of cool to be able to be a little kid and have nobody worry about you finding a stack of comic books, where in today's market and stuff, you really would have to watch what your kids are exposing themselves to. Kind of takes you back to the magic of comics, how it's grown, how we fought for the stigma of comics to kind of be taken away with with certain books and authors like Grant Morrison, Garth Ennis, Alan Moore, Will Eisner. A lot of people giving comic books a sort of an artful credibility, if you will, and to have all that lost now to where the stigma is kind of back, that a lot of people have left YouTube with their channels. A lot of people, how their views are down because people have just left the environment of comics on the internet. And to be reminded of how it all started, how comic books are actually a very personal hobby, to where it's you and the book and that's it. And being a kid was able to kind of expand with your imagination that little world that you're in these little 7 and 8 page stories. Yeah, it's kind of good just to kind of remember where you started and how far you came, and to be able to look back and be like, this is what it was all about.